started on the second epilogue of War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Noah suggests that we divided it from other historical reading of history and read it on that special session, I guess, meaning about method of a historical study. Am I so? Yeah. So, okay. Um, I will resume my reading and then give to you. We're going to pose and discuss certain things. Is that okay for you? So yeah, that's what you want to do is have some discussion on this book, right? So yeah, okay. Well, first I want to give you some background upon my reading or study into historical method. It's called method historical study or study history. So um, with the Western side, as I shared with you, you know, in China, grew up in communist China. They actually center around a certain way to tell you how to study history. So, with those theories populated in the middle of 1800, so like the Civil War time, so no, it's 1800, 1800, prior in the middle of prior to the French Revolution, around those times, making sense to you. So the generation before Abraham, obviously, 100 years before Abraham, the Civil War time. So then those theories from those reasoning arguments, that's prior to that, there is a school of histories. I'm not exactly know what to tell you, like Hume, so who wrote the history of England, huge volumes. So it's one of the founding, this marvelous piece for English history. So I don't think anyone had read that solid a book about England history, the British history. So around this time, he's befriended with Gibbon. I try to give you further some information where I think that's where Tolstoy material came from. I read a little portion, chapter one, in the middle of two. I think he was discussing different people, how he tried to glean from them the way how to look at history, whereas he had different approach and opinion about how to look at history and present history, right? So therefore the book, so of War and Peace, there's a undergirding understanding and try to use a new method or to write history. So for example, in the beginning chapter, a more talking about the heroes or the rulers or the eminent persons in different nations, these historical periods, as the ones history is supposed to concentrate on, and they represent the will of the people or the sometimes divine assignment to them historical period they represent for, the most like the embodiment of the will of the people, right? So, or God's will in certain ways, if they are follower of God, so or not, maybe like Napoleon, maybe not necessarily a believer of God, but definitely an instrument of God, right? So for that period of time. Now, but Tolstoy began to challenge those points we use. So he began to introduce the through War and Peace can clearly see concentrated in normal people's life, right? So he think history is a little bit like a river, don't necessarily have a predestined course where to go, so I don't exactly know. So those ideas, my point is, converge on me not necessarily as a scholarly study, but as a reading a certain history study approach, from Marxism approach, then from learning world peace myself, reading those things, it become an interest to me. So in high school years, I said, well, this is very interesting. So I'm gonna give up other subjects, try to go to college to study history and philosophy. So to understand how human society, how culture, or some history works, basically. I'll tell you where my interest came from. So now, then I went to study economics, and then a little bit lay aside until later on pick up again. I read a lot of history. It's always a hobby to me. So Chinese history, then Western history a little bit. So through the period of time, there are different, they should call it method history, history methodologies, whatever. So I think what I'm trying to detect is the things you come to the times just begin to interest in how history really works, and right, how to interpret history, how human affairs flow together. Not really, I think it's the subject matter or academic approach, rather understand how history really being presented and studied. So where God's purpose, God's approach apply. So with that, I'm gonna conclude my short introduction for you. So yeah, so making sense here. So I do want to tell you, once outstanding thing happened to me is that after I came to the Lord, had some supernatural visitations, looking at the history, when it's markedly changed my reading history different, or rather disinterested me about others' way of reading or writing histories, was because I'm vision. I saw in a timeline the humanity, and I recognize history was perceived in God's eyes, who gives the timeline for human history, abdicating from all the best wise historians have ever presented to me. So I recognize actually is a theme Tolstoy seems against. So one of the reasons I think this morning, reflecting on how to present this to you, I think one of the reasons Tolstoy is more like a scholar, a very good-hearted, God-fearing man, but his mind is still, you can see he tried to study history in a sense different than other historians before them, am I right? The method they applied. But I believe it's still an intellectual quest rather than inspired understanding, So therefore when people like Hume, like Gibbon come on board, we can literally try to offset the old ways from using biblical method in looking at history, in a sense, what God's had in this, what God doing this. So they're more interested in gleaning the material before them, you know, try to do chronological arrangement, those kind of things. So, but basically the undergirding design in their presentation of history was, God is not decider of history. Nothing actually is predestined, So human will or eminent figures history, they play a major role to shape the course of a people or nations, right? So, well, what Tolstoy did said, okay, maybe the biblical view, the old ways review, prior to that is problematic. That these people try to say, okay, it's the heroes of history or nations decide the course of people's lives or nations' lives. But either way, it's problematic, So he tried to say, no, so there must be some new perspective applied. But whereas Tolstoy's way for reading history or presenting history become the major thrust called Tolstoyism, in beginning last century. Yeah, leading up to major thought-provoking movements in among the nations. When the person, for example, communist, study his work and give him a lot of praise. The Russians, leading the communist movement ahead. So they give a lot of high credit to Tolstoy's work and viewpoint, while still criticize him, but more praise than criticism. So around the same time, he is in Tolstoyism. There's called non-resistance, means you don't do violence, you don't engage in war. Basically, denounce war. So the pacifist, So that movement leading to called non-resistant movement, spearheaded by Gandhi. Gandhi is well-educated Indian in English culture, but he came to South Africa. You can read Gandhi's story a little bit, So eventually started a movement called the independence movement of Indian nation and people, So eventually, the British Empire had to give up that colony, So making it into it's a non-violent resistance movement, non-violence. That's continue have its impact over our nations. Let's see, it's spread over in the 60s. That's become the undergirding way of doing things, called the civil rights movement, spearheaded by Martin Luther Jr. No, Martin Luther King Jr. Sorry, yeah. So that's all my understanding. Maybe not that accurate. Okay, I'm just trying to tell you from my stock knowledge, in the sense the undergirding with Tolstoy's his role in historical study. It's we looking at us very innovative in his time, very fresh. He challenged the way how history being looked at, presented before him. And at the same time, he started something that he don't have really a good answer. That's my point. So to my discernment, you ask me how I look at things, so I want to give you on the front first. So my understanding, I in the vision I had, I know God played a major role. He determined human fate. But I don't know how he did it in particular. I'm saying that in the vision, I was shown that the out of body experience. So his proposition, for example, the deity, whatever terms, academic term you can use, describe that God decided human history, and right. So he used human history to accomplish almost like an invisible, undetected purpose of him. So kings, rulers of the world, or historians think they understand how history works. When I had that vision, I understand this is a false idea, So God make kingdom come, then he make kingdom call. He raise up a man to accomplish purpose. He just then subdue a man, So later on, I recognize as more and more read the Bible, that's exactly the biblical view. So which Hume and Gibbon tried to upset, So no, then with that confusion come around, then the rigidity and on the intellectual rather inspired study history, even from biblical view, give a lot of confusion and the bearing, I think, for agile mind like Tolstoy in his time to look at history, especially when in terms of how history should be read or presented, a different approach, So with this book, I suspect, is his a process of working through that, like walking through a jungle. But is his point valid or reasonable? I don't think so.
That's the funny thing about this writing too, is that it's hard to actually figure out what Tolstoy's point is.
Yeah.
Because he approaches it in such almost overbearingly analytical way. Because it's like you're inside his mind. He hasn't even he doesn't even have a point yet.
Yeah.
It's like he's putting together a puzzle. He doesn't know what the picture of the
don't
puzzle
know.
is yet.
It's said.
But he's putting the pieces together still.
Have you read his own description how he writes stories?
No.
Yeah. Okay. It's actually it's in an inspired way. He can't control stories.
Which is interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like some things showed up before him. You know.
Right.
And so, for example, the book where outstanding example was when he wrote Anna Karenina. So he said, I really don't want Anna to die. You know, Anna died. So he was just like fighting against that choice, but the story drive him crazy. So he has to write it for Anna to die. You know, Anna to die. So there's, you know, he was talking about this kind of like the story lead itself. You know, made the conclusion for himself. You know, so I don't know. You know, War and Peace. The starting means long novel for Tolstoy. So it's in the formative years, early years as well. So, but howbeit I try to share with my stock knowledge, my impression about things, even jump ahead with some conclusion. So you understand when I read certain things, I might shake your head a little bit.
Sure.
So don't think I'm arrogant.
That's the thing is, my original purpose in
my point is, don't think I'm arrogant or
No,
try
no.
to be athletic things. I want you to understand. I never read this, you know.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Again, I guess to give a little bit of my intention going through this too is
Yes.
I didn't want it to be something like, does Emmanuel agree or not agree with?
Well, my understanding history is pretty set.
Yeah.
And my point is that even I'm not a historian, I'm not knowing lots of history like a scholar will do, good students, but I understand history.
I just saw this epilogue.
In a spiritual way, if you will. You know? So I hope you understand my point. Yeah. In a cultural way. Go ahead.
I see this as being a good platform, be able to
absolutely
actually think about
absolutely. I'm very delighted and excited that you chose the topic because
this is an author we both really appreciate.
Exactly. This is the things I try to introduce you to Tolstoy for. Actually, yeah. You come to my roots. That's where I'm interested in history, certain things. You know, so because Tolstoy. And others. So
cool.
Yeah. Well, let's read.
Start at the beginning.
Yeah, I'm gonna read a little bit. Okay, so chapter 1. That's basically on the front a little bit to show to you why we read this book together. Okay, so yeah. Chapter 1. History is the life of nations and of humanity. The seeds put into words to describe directly the life of humanity or even of a single nation appears impossible. The ancient historians all employed one and the same method to describe the seas. The apparent elusive the life of a people. They describe the activity of individuals who rule the people and regard the activity of this man as representing the activity of the whole nation. The question: how did the individuals make nations act as they wished, by what was the will of these individuals themselves guided? The ancient met by recognizing a divinity which subjected the nation to the will of a chosen man. Well, that's where the difference is. Historians do that in the historical track record. In the old history, think it's a single leader or eminent figures, right? So a class of eminent man, basically. Almighty man of the old. So, but really, that's where his Tolstoy came to be true. I mean, to be very, very true. It's a people. You know, it's God works through a people. A leader may raise up to represent, even do certain things as a leader. Their deeds are recorded, become the source, the only source for old history, especially to clean things together, chronicle things together. That's the only source it gets. You see my point? You know, so therefore, that's inevitable. The limitation of old historians. You know, says my point. You know, so they don't have like in modern day the material not in how facing the audience. They write history in the beginning most is telling stories, so
Yeah.
making sense to you? It's like writing a paper, newspaper. You write a novel for people for entertainment purposes rather than for study history purposes, for chronicle things existed, make record things rather than to understand what the recording really is about, so for matter of such, in the at least in the preliminary, let's see, in the beginning phase of history, it's about the recording things, compiling things. Few actually applied, said consciously said, "Oh, how history actually works." So the later days, people come around to study those raw materials and they look back, see more knowledge about the things that happened long period of time. They begin to think, oh, there might be some undergirding principle or ways how history actually played out. Or because of human affairs in world history, we can study the past and learn some lesson for current and for future, interpret what's going on in the world around us, right? So, where we should uh, learn the lessons, from the past, and give guidance to the future. So that's the time people begin to try to say, okay, how we study history, what use history, what a purpose for history, So um, unfortunately, except one is steep and really inspired by the history that is represented by the Bible. If we don't challenge or now educating those ways, in their way of interpreting history, writing history, or introducing history to others, is going to be fundamentally skewed. That's my point. So therefore, I think inevitably they would concentrate more on their eminent figures and leaders of the day, try to present history. So now, what revolutionary about Tolstoy and the other projects said, well, history might not just narrow down. The scriptures, the text here said, on a chosen man, chosen rulers or leaders, rather maybe a chosen people, maybe a people, whether divine inspired or guided. No. My understanding in this, if you will, I don't think it's a particular man involved. Even they embody a spirited period, or God used them instrumentally to accomplish the will, guiding a people through a period of time. But my understanding is it's the people who choose. It's the people who choose. That's what I actually recognized in the visitation I had. Is I found there are remnant people. God, you pretty much don't worry about human history. Human history is like a firework. The real home life is in the stove. God is doing things totally different than what we think history is. Means God's will and God's interest in human history is not the things that will common sense major targets and interests the historical study is about how the people moved, what happened to the people in this history, what happened to people in the world, basically. So never even think there's somebody maybe unknown, somebody not necessarily have a great impact, in the time they are, am I like a prophet, am I? So they like a Tolstoy. Look at Tolstoy's life. Tolstoy is a politician, a king, a great military man, a general. And compared to Napoleon and Tolstoy, let's see who really have a huge impact over human history. I would argue Tolstoy maybe have more, right? So people quickly forgot what Napoleon did, and the impact quickly ceded. But Tolstoy shaped the human mind, human understanding, continue to inspire people to think about things, to value things, to appreciate and disappreciate. What is the word? It's just, well, that's bad. That's good. So, well, who care about important thing today? Do you care about important thing? You may have a residue his greenness when some French ruler want to recover the glory for France. Maybe that may be something people will care about, or some, historical as a hobby want to know exactly what he thinks, right? So, or he do his war, or he do his political intrigues. But in the end of the day, who cares what you think? As a humanity wise, as design a culture, design society wise. But nobody in this day's hour, if he's an educated man, will say, I don't care what Tolstoy think. Because that's just inevitable unless you're foolish, uninformed, or educated man. And that's my point. You will not say, okay, Tolstoy doesn't matter. Tolstoy matters a lot in the past century, even today, right? Ongoing. Civil rights movements changed American society. The non-violent resistance movement that changes the whole picture for Britain history, how they played out. The Indians as a nation, it still continues in the world. So that's my point. Played a huge restraint. People used to use a revolution, violence, mass revolt to attain onto goals. So making sense to you. So basically a mob culture. Right now, people say more organized. People say, no, maybe turn to violence, turn to revolt. That nature is not a way to go to change the society. That's my point. How many bloodshed was spared? So how many minds are shaped because one man thoughts thinking about things. So my point. So you can see, I'll just give you a living example with a sense. Any historian said, well, Napoleon is the greatest figure. Until we talk about literature, we don't even think about Tolstoy, right? So the truth of the matter, are you kidding me? In this pure, simple evaluation, who is more important, more influential in human history? Who is it? France was important in death. The glory faded. That time movement faded. Well, Napoleon doesn't make a dent to any other society, right? What about Tolstoy? Influenced generation after generation, society after society, the people's choice and the thinking, right? So making sense too, So I'm talking differently now. Draw back to that. If you really want to understand history from this pure intellectual level, so what kind of man you want to be? That's a choice, right? So you want Napoleon, doesn't mean Napoleon is a bad thing. It's a bad man. I'm just talking about it. That you can change the nation and doing certain things, but I would think, for me, I want to be a Tolstoy. So that natural choice for me. So making sense to you. So in this light, the comment I spread out here is the will of a chosen man. I would think, if we really revise it, what Tolstoy trying to verify is there a will of a chosen people? I would have said it's a will of a chosen people, a remnant people. Okay.
Yeah.
And the body of real history in God's side is not the history of a historical people's the mass, but rather his chosen people, what they went through. Like Abraham, planting the margin of many great culture, great nations. Nobody really make a record of his life until we have the Bible record, right? So, well, who remember him? Who think about him? The truth matter today, understanding more than the Bible record. All the Muslims think Abraham their father. Am I? 3 major religions in the world: Judaism, Christianity, and the Muslims. All are turning to this man of faith, who's walking a little bit strange, am I? To draw inspiration and draw principles. How the worship began, how to conduct their the individual and national life, right? So even you see my point, So go ahead. Yeah. I'm sorry. Gonna move on. Comments from you at this point. Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed in this beginning of the epilogue here, he is obviously, as we already know, he's not establishing yet his point of view as to what the force of the impetus of history is, but he's
Yes.
first drawing what he observes the perspective of the ancient historians to be,
Yes.
and then comparing it to the perspective of modern historians.
Modern history is
and how
his
they,
time. Yeah.
modern historians, as he'll say,
Okay.
negate the fact that history is
Divine.
the force of history is caused by chosen men who have the divine influence of
great. Yeah.
divine being, causing things to happen.
Yeah. Well, you had to forgive me because I had to comment. I don't know.
No, it's
and
good.
I read this book, so I comment
you
as
may even be ahead of yourself there too, because
is
not
that
that,
right?
that you're saying anything
That's okay.
wrong, or but you're saying things that he's actually going to be.
He's gonna say, yeah. So
yeah.
I try to dumb on you to give you my understanding of history a little bit. From
Good.
that point you can understand where how I comment on things. Making sense to you? So, yeah. So I guided the will of that chosen man so as to accomplish ends that were predestined. Why don't you read on from here?
For the ancients, these questions were solved by a belief in the direct participation of the deity in human affairs. Modern history and theory rejects both these principles. It would seem that having rejected the belief of the ancients in
obviously modern history to him, that's his pure time, right?
Yeah.
So,
It would seem that having rejected the belief of the ancients in man's subjection to the deity in a predetermined aim toward which nations are led, modern history should study not the manifestations of power, but the causes that produce it. But modern history has not done this. Having in theory rejected the view held by the ancients, it still follows them in practice.
That's where king of the wisdom. That's so true.
Yeah.
Because there's no way for them to get out yet. So,
Right.
yeah. Now, interesting enough, that's not really 100% accurate assessment of those times of a historical study. Now, Tolstoy is not oblivious to Marxism idea of understanding history and Hegel's idea of understanding history. Now you have to understand those thinkers or philosophers, especially in the German world, has put a lot of stock into try to understand history. They literally called philosophy for histories. Hegel developed a lot of time to expound his philosophy's insight about human affairs in terms of history. He presented a whole system of understanding. Then later on, others like with him, even around him, like Kant, like Fenerbahce. Then later on, the later comers become communists, invented communism, created communism. That is Marxism, Karl Marx, and Engels. That's first name, Frederick Engels. So they began to write and presented a new theory. That one of the major branches of their theory, communism talking about, is about how to read history, and they draw that as a science. Said, okay, this is how history has works, how history should be looked at it. They come up with a class struggle, right? So different classes, then combined with the economic theories, then they begin to project what the human society should be. Basically, it's more like a utopian kind of thing. Communism is utopian based, Utopian is from biblical idea for a future world. Peace, equity, those kind of things. No war, stuff like that. But put God out of the picture. So, in a sense, my point is that his Tolstoy is not immune, rather steep in reading those materials in his time. So when he talks about modern history, look at things more about the historical books itself rather than the philosophies that the study history has is different story. Okay, because somebody writing history, for sure they have to talk about different characters with the material that ahead of them. but there is a stirring. People said, okay, how we look at history by itself, so rather than recording or writing history books, so that's the philosopher today. That is hugely an inspiration in the background why Tolstoy interested in thinking history as a topic and try to come to his own conclusions. That's you read his biography, you understand that. So, did you read his biography? Has part of it? Yeah.
A part of his.
A part of why he interested in history, why he write War and Peace, for example. So
I can't remember the details. It's been a little while, but
yeah, that's because he was immensely interested in history. So he read a lot to try to figure out his own conclusions. It's not one time for sure. It's decade long effort. So, but War and Peace is in the middle of that. So it's like a conclusion of his study of history. So go ahead. Meditation on history. So
right, I do know that in the beginning he was gonna call this book, I think, The War of 1812.
Is that right? Yeah.
And then he's like, well, I have to go back a little bit further than that because I can't start 1812 because of the events that happened before that.
Yeah.
And then he's like, well, there's these events even
there. You go.
I have to go back even
that
further.
That is the process of studying history with it. Yeah.
It's kind of the inception of those things.
Yeah.
With that.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the formation of your thoughts.
Yeah.
So yeah. Go ahead. I will try to furnish this information to you in my. It's not accurate because I don't read things,
sure.
But I have been reading Tolstoy's life a little bit, so as a topic for a while actually study his life. So, so I remember certain things.
Sure.
So yeah, go ahead.
Instead of men endowed with divine authority and directly guided by the will of God, modern history has given us either heroes endowed with extraordinary, superhuman capacities, or simply men of various kinds, from monarchs to journalists who lead the masses. Instead of the former divinely appointed aims of the Jewish, Greek, or Roman nations, which ancient historians regarded as representing the progress of humanity, modern history has postulated its own aims: the welfare of the French, German, or English people, or in its highest abstraction, the welfare and civilization of humanity in general, by which is usually meant that of the peoples occupying a small northwesterly portion.
Oh yeah, continent. Okay. As you talk about us, I'm joking. Yeah. I'm gonna tease you. Okay, I want to relax. So,
sure.
Yeah. This is casual reading. Okay.
Yeah,
sure. So.
Modern history has rejected the beliefs of the ancients without replacing them by a new conception. And the logic of the situation has obliged the historians, after they had apparently rejected the divine authority of the kings and the fate of the ancients, to reach the same conclusion by another road. That is, to recognize, number one, nations guided by individual men, and number two, the existence of a known aim to which these nations and humanity are at large are tending.
Obviously, that's a false proposition in any good way for looking at history, right? So, which is identified, but that's a way of undergirding. You can imply that the people writing history, they think that's what happened in history, So, on the other hand, I do want to talk about something I forgot. At that time, also philosophers of various schools or different corners began to challenge, because the French Revolution happened 100 years ago. British already adopted parliamentary system. American founding was over 100 years as well, 1967. You can see, so Tolstoy in the 100 years later come, so the idea of enlightenment and the other method of understanding in terms of challenging this idea for divine authority, for kingship, promoted by super corrupted, perverted minds like King Louis from France, then transplanted to England, become Henry VIII, those kind of stupid kings. Sorry, the word, foolish kings. Just give a perfect picture of what corrupted divine kingship look like. So it's literally spread over because the practice of rulership and nationhood, whatever, is give a perfect picture of the foolishness of this idea. Uh, History said it is the divine chosen one, given the authority, given the power to guide the fate of the nation under God's of endowment, right? So it created a, after 100 years later, when things begin to be falling apart, putting other systems put in place like American, now it's a constitutional republic, so British become a monarchy that is also constrained by Republicans parliamentary system. British is the real. I'm sorry. Um, Tolstoy still going through in his lifetime. Bonaparte and other things going on, right? So the French are trying to find the footing, what kind of system work for them. All the Europe with it, even then in Tolstoy time, the Russian as empire still ruled by after Alexander the Second. I'm not sure now. So still this monarchy is still overwhelmingly oppressive in his time. It's like Russians are still lagging half a century behind, even a century behind the development of other thoughts, other practices, other nations, right? So where the intellectuals, upper class, draw inspiration from those cultures, those took place well in other nations, Europe, America, for example. You might have heard um, uh, uh, Tolstoy is a Lincoln's time, right? They actually aware of one another when Lincoln declared what called emancipation of the slave. Tolstoy celebrate. I'm not too sure. Okay, 100% sure, but there are some. Um, Tolstoy is not unaware, uninformed of those new development history in a sense from Europe, from America. So it narrowed him down to a place, not narrowed down, furnished him to thinking about, and the revolution come with the philosophers, am I talking about whether the kingship is a valid system or not, am I stuff like that, so John Locke, others, Montesquieu, Walter, those are French thinkers or British thinkers, begin to say there's another way to organize the government. You might be aware of those things. So Tolstoy read all those. He's a very avid reader. So, and he tried to console in his own light, try to think about the histories. So in this light, so you can see that's basically what I think is about. So go ahead. Mm-hmm. Watch. I don't want to give you comment about the furnished information you might, you know, elude your attention because you don't necessarily know where it came from in terms
Sure,
of
sure.
yeah. So yeah, go ahead.
At the basis of the works of all the modern historians, from Gibbon to Buckle, despite their seeming disagreements and the apparent novelty of their outlooks, lie those two old, unavoidable assumptions.
Yeah. Well, Gibbon and Hume literally conspire together the society to use history to undermine Christian faith. Okay, this is not something that I try to tell you falsely. That was a historical record, So because the church and the Christian influence was so overwhelming, there's no other way for them to say, can we influence other way of thinking? So all of them choose either using essays, writing, philosophy, whatever, or they think the most important tool, the most effective tool is actually history. That was the reason why they write histories. The main reason, the interest in history, but there's a hidden agenda behind it, is that they want to use a history book. History is right to honor my Christian understanding, Christian idea for how history being looked at it, but more important, how Christians should not exercise a dominant impact over society, So that's the time, So it's like suppressed, So Christians like were oppressive presence in those days. I'm talking about the political the kingship, whatever, Catholic dominance, and then with England, it was English branch of called Protestantism, so Anglican, that's where it started from here is. But my point is they don't want others to talk about the Bible, don't want them to challenge the hierarchy built about kingship, whatever, in the religion. Christianity become religion, a state religion, so therefore the independent thinker like Hume, like Gibbon, had no other ways to express their ideas, so they use history as a starting point to express their idea, actually. So if I'm making sense to you, so yeah, so then later comers like Tolstoy read their books and wow, this is the fundamental upsetting the way how history being read, presented. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the first place, the historian describes the activity of individuals who, in his opinion, have directed humanity. One historian considers only monarchs, generals, and ministers as being such men, while another includes also orators, learned men, reformers, philosophers, and poets. Secondly, it is assumed that the goal toward which humanity is being led...
Let's give a query to you for your inspiration in a sense. So let's see this list. Orators, who you can think about.
Maybe an old classic example like Cicero.
Yeah, there you go. Okay. Learned man.
Learned men. Well, you have somebody even like Tolstoy or
Gibbon, right?
Yeah.
Tolstoy think about the learned man.
Huh?
Tolstoy has to think about learned man. His idea
From
of
his
learned man.
perspective,
Yeah,
sure.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some learned man, right? So
Yeah.
the Capgras, So yeah. Or Alexander. Oh no, so I don't know. Not Alexander. What is it called? Aristotle. So Plato, whatever. So reformers. Second about reform. I think Luther. Right? So yes. Okay. Philosophers. Karl Marx, Hegel. Right? So yeah. Okay. Immanuel Kant, right? So poets, the poets, right? Shakespeare,
Lots of poets.
yeah, Byron, yeah, exactly. Now I think Pushkin was before Tolstoy.
Yeah, I'm actually reading Eugene Onegin right now.
What's that? That's his book.
That's his main
work.
That had
Oh yeah.
Huge influence on really all
Russian
authors.
Russian. Yeah, exactly. There's a book. Pushkin is very rebellious, discontent with exact hard-headed.
Yeah.
His one thing is admired is Byron. Byron is a revolutionist, died in revolution, so revolt the prevailing system, basically, So they're interesting. So anyway, that's kind of poet, So the modern poet is really action. I mean, activist in charting a different
He
way
reminds
society.
me, for some reason, of
Yes.
Alexander Hamilton because of his attitude and even the way he died.
Yeah, like a flare, right? So flared up
very
thing. Yeah.
Impactful, but quick flare.
Quickly died out. Yes. Yeah.
Interesting.
Byron's died about 30-some years old. I think Pushkin is the same thing. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
Secondly, it is assumed that the goal toward which humanity is being
My interest, sorry to interrupt you all the time, because reading is exciting to me. It's like bring many things together, bring many reading together. So my point is to interrupt you doing things that nature is for you to look at things from the point why Tolstoy said what he said, right? So go ahead. To understand he's as a person, So
Secondly, it is assumed that the goal toward which humanity is being led is known to the historians. To one of them, this goal is the greatness of the Roman, Spanish, or French realm. To another, it is liberty, equality, and a certain kind of civilization of a small corner of the world called Europe. In 1789, a ferment arises in Paris. It grows, spreads, and is expressed by a movement of peoples from west to east. Several times, it moves eastward and collides with a counter-movement from the east westward. In 1812, it reaches its extreme limit, Moscow, And then, with remarkable symmetry, a counter-movement occurs from east to west, attracting to it, as the first movement had done, the nations of Middle Europe. The counter-movement reaches the starting point of the first movement in the west, Paris, and subsides.
He's talking about that.
Basically a description of this book.
Is that right?
Yeah,
Okay.
everything that happened in this
Yeah,
book.
exactly. Like the French Revolution, you
Yeah.
know, then come back with the demise of Napoleon and so.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
During that 20-year period, an immense number of fields were left untilled, houses were burned, trade changed its direction, millions of men migrated, were impoverished, or were enriched, and millions of Christian men professing the law of love of their fellows slew one another. What does all this mean? Why did it happen?
You see, it's really reckoning, right? He was doing in his own side reckoning the history that's happened, right,
Yeah.
in the past half century or so. Yeah.
Right. What made those people burn houses and slay their fellow men? What were the causes of these events? What force made men act so? These are the instinctive, plain, and most legitimate questions humanity asks itself when it encounters the monuments and tradition of that period. For a reply to these questions, the common sense of mankind turns to the science of history.
You call it what? The science history.
He does.
They literally
He does
believe.
approach it very scientifically.
Yeah, they really believe there's a science of history. So, yeah.
Whose
Just like
aim-
any other sciences, you know. So that's
kind of
the
what
thing.
sociology turned into.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
it's an
Still
actual
today,
science.
people think history is a science. You know,
Yeah.
that's ridiculous. History is not a
ways.
science. You know? Sorry, science is measurable. You know, you do this, causation, right? Do this, that happened, right?
Is or is it not quantifiable? Is what
Exactly, it's history.
explain here.
Yeah, which is a means to
He even
us.
approaches history.
I'm sorry,
In
yeah.
like there's formulas of history.
Yes, formula
that
is
can
history.
be applied to events to be able to even scientifically.
Yes,
explain them.
yeah. That's the arrogance of man eventually try to do social engineering. You know, so yeah, go ahead.
The science of history, whose aim is to enable nations and humanity to know themselves. Know thyself. If history had retained the conception of the ancients, it would have said that God, to reward or punish his people, gave Napoleon power and directed his will to the fulfillment of the divine end.
Well, Nova, I just want to ask a comment there. It's very exciting to me to see you interested in this stuff.
Well, it is very interesting. I think.
Yeah, because those are things is, I was waiting for you to show some interest in us. I can't talk to anybody about this stuff if they're not interested in us. So I'm not scholar approach in a sense, but I
mean,
these things were interesting to me, you know, especially in young days. Go ahead.
Gave Napoleon power and directed his will to the fulfillment of the divine ends. And that reply would have been clear and complete. One might believe or disbelieve in the divine significance of Napoleon, but for anyone believing in it, there would have been nothing unintelligible in the history of that period, nor would there have been any contradictions. But modern history cannot give that reply. Science does not admit the conception of the ancients as to the direct participation of the deity in human affairs, and therefore history ought to give other answers.
Yeah, there we go. Contradiction. Science, deity.
Modern history replying to these questions says, you want to know what this movement means, what caused it, and what force produced these events? Then listen. Louis XIV was a very proud and self-confident man. He had such and such mistresses and such ministers, and he ruled France badly. His descendants were weak men, and they too ruled France badly. And they had such and such favorites and such mistresses. Moreover, certain men wrote some books at the time. At the end of the 18th century, there were a couple of dozen men in Paris who began to talk about all men being free and equal. This caused people all over France to begin to slash at and drown one another.
That's a Freemasonry movement, actually, you know, relating, yeah.
They killed the king and many other people. At that time, there was in France a man of genius, Napoleon. He conquered everybody everywhere. That is, he killed many people because he was a great genius. He's being super sarcastic right now. And for some reason, he went to kill Africans and killed them so well that and was so cunning and wise that when he returned to France, he ordered everybody to obey him.
That's
and they all
not
obeyed him.
that's not true history actually. He went to Egypt, he lost the battle, so
Yeah.
he was being killed.
But he's
so.
talking from this historian.
I know. So yeah. So.
Having become an emperor, he again went out to kill people in Italy, a great many.
Yeah.
In Russia, there was an emperor, Alexander, who decided to restore order in Europe and therefore fought against Napoleon. In 1807, he suddenly made friends with him, but in 1811 they again quarreled and began killing many people. Napoleon led 600,000 men into Russia and captured Moscow.
I think that's around the time he was born. So yeah.
Who, Tolstoy?
Yeah, shortly after, in the middle of it. I'm not too sure now. So.
I think 1820s. I'm not sure though.
1820. Yeah. His father was involved. His wars.
Father was
yeah.
His
yeah.
grandfather, especially.
Is that right?
His
Okay.
grandfather was,
Yeah.
He actually alludes to his grandfather in the book, Tolstoy or something.
Oh yeah, he's a general or something. Yeah.
One of his ancestors.
Okay. Oh, I forgot those details. So yeah. So he was very intimate with the certain events of this, So yeah. Mm-hmm.
Then he suddenly ran away from Moscow, and the Emperor Alexander, helped by the advice of Stein and others, united Europe to arm against the disturber of its peace. All Napoleon's allies suddenly became his enemies, and their forces advanced against the fresh forces he raised. The allies defeated Napoleon, entered Paris, forced Napoleon to abdicate, and sent him to the island of Elba, not depriving him of the title of emperor and showing him every respect, though 5 years before and 1 year later they all regarded him as an outlaw and a brigand. Then Louis XVIII, who till then had been the laughingstock both of the French and the Allies, began to reign. And Napoleon, shedding tears before his old guards, renounced the throne and went into exile. Then the skillful statesmen and diplomatists, especially Talleyrand, who managed to sit down in a particular chair before anyone else, and thereby extended the frontiers of France, talked in Vienna, and by these conversations made the nations happy or unhappy. Suddenly the diplomatists and monarchs nearly quarreled, and were on the point of again ordering their armies to kill one another. But just then Napoleon arrived in France with a battalion, and the French, who had been hating him, immediately all submitted to him. But the allied monarchs were angry at this and went to fight the French once more.
One of the things we need to recognize, maybe it's not that outstanding a point, I just want to throw out there. So they don't have news like them, right? News, broadcasting, stuff like that. So what have you? One story every day, just approximate to the new developments, they will share those story to the next their own opinions. Eventually the story becomes so distorted, that's where things came to be. So I'm just talking to you. So I think War and Peace started with those kind of things, right? In the salon, different people had different opinion what Napoleon looked like. Stuff
right. The little parties that were started by one of the characters.
Yeah, exactly. So
there's several instances of that. Just groups of wealthy.
They think he's Antichrist or something like that, right? Yeah. And Alexander the Saver, So. God's arm bearer, whatever. So it's like you understand the kind of thing, So go ahead.
And they defeated the genius Napoleon, and suddenly recognizing him as a brigand, sent him to the island of Saint Helena. And the exile, separated from the beloved France so dear to his heart, died a lingering death at that rock and bequeathed his great deeds to posterity. But in Europe, a reaction occurred, and the sovereigns once again all began to oppress their subjects.
Well, you wanted to talk about, we might just stop there to think about the launch. What's the launch situation?